Yes, in the Sabbath in Italy spread through into the north under Ambrose at Milan, kept the Sabbath in Milan, and that's when he went to Rome. He was then forced to keep Sunday in Rome, and that's gave rise to the saying, when in Rome, do as Rome does. And the references are there in Hyland's work. And so the church in Milan from the 4th century, as it was the centre of Sabbath keeping in the West. And that's important. And there was a nucleus of Sabbath keeping in tradition in Europe between Milan and Lyon, which became the centre of the poor men of Lyon, a branch of the Sabbatati, or the Insabbatati, which later became Waldensians. They were termed Waldensians. And the Milan-Lyon nexus was facilitated by Pothimus and Irenaeus from 125 to 203 CE. So all this is early, entrenched, long before Sunday worship was pushed out from Rome. Both were disciples, that is Irenaeus and Pothimus were disciples of Polycarp, disciple of John, and both were Sabbath-keeping. Irenaeus became Bishop of Lyon after the martyrdom of Pothimus in 177 under the persecution of Marcus Aurelius. The church at Lyon and Vienne, reporting on their persecution in 177, and probably as a result of that persecution, argued for clemency for the Frisian Montanists, but they themselves were prudent in their views and not Montanists. See the Catholic Encyclopedia article Montanists in that regard. The Montanists and the prophetess Maximilla or Priscilla prophesied with ecstatic utterances, probably from the influence of the cult of Cybele in Frisia. They and their followers were condemned. Now, Irenaeus was a Unitarian, as was Justin Martyr and all the ante-Nicene apologists. He stated that the church held one constant belief, that is, that there was but one creator of the world, God the Father. You see that in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 1, Against Heresies, Book 2, Chapter 9, page 369. He stated that the church position was that perfect righteousness was conferred neither by any other legal ceremonies. The Decalogue, however, was not cancelled by Christ, but is always in force, and men were never released from its commandments. That's an important statement of one of the fathers, and he studied under John and knew the people who knew the Christ. Perfect righteousness was conferred neither by any other legal ceremonies, but by the law and the commandments of God. Now we quoted Ezekiel in chapter 20, verse 12, and Moses from Exodus 21:13, referring to the Sabbaths as a sign between God and his people. Right. And that's exactly what it is, the sign between God and his people. The Sabbaths were given as a sign, which was also symbolical. The Sabbaths taught that we should continue day by day in God's service, and man was not justified by them, but they were given as a sign to the people. You see that in page 481. So also Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch at the time of Trajan, that's 98 to 117 CE, argues against the Judaizing tendencies of his territory. The tenacious survival and veneration of Jewish institutions, such as the Sabbath, are explicitly mentioned by this author. You see that in the Epistle to the Magnesians. See also Bacchiocchi on that in page 213. It's then hardly conceivable that a radical break from Sabbath keeping had already taken place. It had not. It's obvious that Ignatius was combating Jewish traditional practices on the Sabbath, which was kept by both parties. And that's what is at hand, this oral tradition intruding into Jewish practices on the Sabbath.
Right.
So it goes through dealing with with Justin Martyr's position on the Sabbath. He was a Unitarian Sabbath keeper. And he introduces the concept of Sunday worship in his dialogue with Trypho.
And that really is sort of something that they agree on, don't they? That the Sabbath has to be kept for you to be classed either as a Christian or someone who worships the true God. Yet, these Trinitarians, Catholics, switch it to a Sunday.
Yes.
And so it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
We know it does. I mean, it's supposed to be the last day.
When they got rid of the Sabbath and brought Sunday in from Rome, they weren't Trinitarians at all. Trinitarianism didn't exist until 391, and then ratified in 451 at the Council of Chalcedon. 391 at the Council of Constantinople, 451 at the Council of Chalcedon. And up until then, they were binitarians from the Council of Nicaea in 325. But they were this modalist structure up until then through the 3rd century. But Trinitarianism didn't arise until the end of the 4th century. It didn't exist. There was no such thing as a Trinitarian until the end of the 4th century. And they weren't Sunday worshippers as a rule, except in Rome in the 2nd century. At the end of the 2nd century, they became Sunday worshippers and Easter keepers from Rome, not anywhere else.
Yeah, and that was because they started to bring in or introduce Babylonian mystery cult religions and...
Yes, from the worship of the god Attis. They brought in the Attis and Cybele were the two deities, the female deity and the male Attis. They brought in the 1st century BC. They brought in Mithras in 63 BC from Pompey, captured some Cilician pirates and brought them in. So they ended up with these sun and mystery cults in Rome, and they were carting the god Attis around Rome on a sun cross. And that's where the symbol came from, and it didn't come from Christ at all. Christ was crucified or killed on a stauros. He's executed on a stake, not a cross. And that system of the Sunday keepers was from Attis and the sun mystery and sun cults in the Middle East.
Pagan symbolism.
Yes, and it was Adonis in the East, and then the triune system in Alexandria of Osiris and Isis and Horus.
Horus, that's right, yeah.
None of them had anything to do with biblical Christianity. Now, the intent of the Sabbaths was understood by the early writers to be spiritual, whereas the Jews tied to the physical, and this is the essence of the debate. The removal of the Sabbath and the substitution of Sunday would have been abhorrent to all of those people.
Right, yeah.
And that included the people we were referred to earlier in the section as also the Nazarenes also did not observe Sunday, as is supposed by Epiphanius. The Nazarenes, whose existence is the 4th century, is attested to by Jerome, and appear to be direct descendants of the Christian community of Jerusalem who migrated to Pella. So Bacchiocchi says also. So the church at Lyon under Irenaeus intervened in the Quartodeciman dispute, and you see Butler's Lives of the Saints and also the Passover Papers. He spread early Christianity through much of Gaul and dealt a death blow to the forms of Gnosticism being entrenched there. Lyon at the time, in the time of Pothinus and Irenaeus, was the centre of the church in Gaul and was the centre for conversion. So all of this is extremely important. This is the history of the Sabbath-keeping church. And it's most important that if you want to be a Christian and you want to be in the first resurrection, you better understand what your predecessors believed and what they fought for and what they died for. Because there were millions of them, over 2,000 years, that died for the faith. And it's not evident at the moment in much of the world.
No.
And what seems a bit somewhat ironic about that is that the ones that were martyred were all Saturday Sabbath keepers, where the ones that were running around on a Saturday gleefully singing and saying we've got it right were left alone, weren't they?
Well, when you say gleefully, it was the people who were keeping the Sabbath as the saints of God that were put through the martyrdom process.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, the people who were keeping Sunday and doing what they wanted to do and trading and doing whatever on the Sabbath were protected by the so-called Roman
Authorities.
authorities.
Yeah.
And the church, most of the early church, were martyrs in Rome, not running things into the ground. In the year 318, when Constantine was declared emperor at Rome, at York in Britain in 309 of the current era. Now, what he did was, he had tried to establish the Christian church as the church in the empire. He wanted to unify the structure. He himself was not a Christian. He wasn't baptized until the year 327, when he was on his deathbed virtually, and he was baptized by the Unitarian Sabbath keeper of the Bishop of Nicomedia.
Right.
What happened was that in the year 318, Constantine ordered Bishop Sylvester of Rome to meet with the family of Jesus Christ, all of the Desposini. They were called the Desposini, which is a Greek word meaning belonging to the Lord. Now, these people were all Sabbath keepers. They were right throughout the area, Jerusalem through to Antioch and to the different areas, and they were bishops in that period, and they were being deposed. They were deposed by the Greeks, and they met with Sylvester, and they said that the tithe has to be reintroduced, and that the structure of the Sabbaths and the church has to be reorganised, and they had to be put back in their bishoprics at Jerusalem and at Antioch and at the number of different Alexandria in the different areas. Sylvester then simply arranged for their persecution and extermination, and after 318 they became persecuted by the Roman Church and Roman national systems, so that they were forced into virtual extermination.
Wow.
And that's Britain. They couldn't touch them because the church in Britain was Unitarian Sabbath keeping, and the royal family, the family of Christ, was actually the royal family of the Welsh system, the British kings right through down until the last of the family of the Welsh princes and kings finished with Rhys ap Griffith in the 12th century. But they're all there, still in Wales and right through into England and across into Ireland and up into Scotland. They're all still there, still existing, all in different branches and families, and they're so widespread you'd have to exterminate the entire British Isles to get rid of them. It's that widespread.
Right. Wow.
And when you look at it, for instance, Neil of the Nine Hostages went across, invaded Britain, named Old Scotia, Scotland, went into Gaul, nearly booted the Romans out of Gaul entirely and put them back into Rome, brought 200 captives back to Ireland, including St. Patrick, who became St. Patrick of Ireland. He was not a Catholic, he was not a Trinitarian, he was a Sabbatarian, Unitarian leader of the church. And Neil's mother herself was one of a British princess of the line back to Joseph of Arimathea.
Right. Yeah.
Now, that group, Neil is the father of 5% of the Irish people today. Right? So 5% of the Irish people, through Neil alone, are related back to the Christ.
Right.
And then they're all over the place, and they went through, and the Scots are also, and through from Northumbria, they became part of the system. They were all related back to these families. When you see in 067c the Hittites in the house of David, you'll see the names of these princes and leaders, and from those names you see whole family structures, names come off the names. Like Afflug, one of the kings is the head of the clan Affleck.
Right.
And it goes on through all of those areas, so that clans everywhere are now so interspersed, and the structure of Joseph of Arimathea, son of Matthat. Joseph of Arimathea was the 40th son of King David, so that through Nathan.
Right.
And he was the great uncle of the Christ. From Joseph, I personally am the 50th grandson of Joseph of Arimathea and the 90th grandson of King David.
Right.
And that's how widespread it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's spread all through all of our people. Like your mother was an Owen.
That's right. They were Welsh. Mm.
Yes, yeah. Which is a Welsh which comes from the line back from Joseph of Arimathea. You and I are cousins somewhere back in the lineage.
Amazing.
And in the same way, we've got many cousins.
Yes.
in our system, and you look at some of the names that, for instance, Neil of the Nine Hostages, there are different clans, like the O'Neills and the Dohertys, the Higgins, and my great-grandmother is from the Gohagans, which was from Eochigan, which means little horse. He was the third son of Neil of the Nine Hostages, which means that you got the people are related, and no matter how distantly. And you find that he was from the 4th century, so you probably got people up to the 45th level of cousins, and far closer than that if you come down.
Coming back closer, yeah.
Yeah. So that is really important stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Well, that does. It helps you to understand where all these Sabbath-keeping churches and people went, doesn't it? They went out, but they did actually keep that same Sabbath.
Yes.
You know, worldwide, they were all keeping the Saturday Sabbath. Yeah.
Yes, they were all keeping the Saturday Sabbath, and they were also assisted by heavy concentrations of Jews around Marseille and Genoa over the period of 100 to 300 CE, and you see that in Gilbert's Atlas of the Jewish History, Dorset Press and Map 17. These communities were obviously in contact with the heavy concentrations of Jews in Ephesus and Smyrna. The movements on the Rhine from Marseille to Lyon, to the metropolis and centre of communications with the whole country, is no doubt a result of the Jewish participation in commerce. And the demands of the community are probably what prompted the dispatch of Pothinus and Irenaeus to Lyon from Polycarp in Smyrna. Thus there was a Sabbath-keeping church established in Lyon prior to the persecution of Marcus Aurelius in 177.
Right.
Leon was the centre of the churches in Gaul when Irenaeus was made bishop, and the Church of Gaul wrote to Rome over the Quartodeciman controversy. And you see that in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History 5:23 in support of the Asian bishops contesting the introduction of Easter. Right. Easter is not a Christian festival.
No.
Easter is the name of the goddess. Just look up the Oxford Dictionary, and Easter, it will say, and the Oxford Universal Dictionary will say, the name of the goddess. No argument about it, no equivocation. Easter is the equivalent of Ishtar or Astarte.
Okay, yeah.
That is the goddess, the consort of Baal.
Baal, yeah.
So you keep Easter, you're a Baal worshipper, you're not a Christian. Now, all of this continues on. The different dioceses, Council of Arles records that there were a number of dioceses established at the time, around 314, coinciding with the Edict of Toleration of Milan, and the signatories of the bishops still in existence proved the following sees: Vienne, Marseille, Arles, Orange, Vaison, Apt, Nice, Lyon, Autun, Cologne, Trier, Reims, Rouen, Bordeaux, Gabali, and Euse. The sees of Toulouse, Narbonne, Clermont, Bourges, and Paris must also be admitted. So that's the extent you're looking at. Before 314, these sees were established, existed, and are noted. And the Trinitarian Church in the Catholic Encyclopedia lists all of those sees. So there's no argument about it. Nobody's arguing that these sees didn't exist. Also, the Sabbatarian system was not monastic. Monasticism did not enter the Gaulish churches until introduced by Martin, and that's died around 397, who founded Marmoutia near Tours, and Cassian died around 435, who founded the two churches at Marseille around 415. By and large, Christianity was confined to the cities among the more educated and perhaps Jewish-influenced groups. The real people were pagans, with infusions of the Gallo-Celt and Roman superstitions. The conversion of the Goths, Vandals, Suevi, Alans, etc. to Unitarianism, incorrectly termed Arianism, from the beginning of the 4th century, ended the Roman Trinitarian and Sunday-keeping ambitions for some time. Right. And we'll deal with those in the Unitarian-Trinitarian wars also. The episcopal sees of Gaul became objects of aristocratic greed under Roman influence. Honoratus founded a monastery in the island of Lawrence, that's Laurinum. From there, the episcopates were taken over, and the so-called Orthodox graduates of Lorraine placed in many dioceses. Honoratus, Hilary, and Caesarius were placed at Arles, Eucharius at Lyon, and his son Solonius and Veranius at Geneva and Venice respectively. Lupus was at Troyes, Maximus and Faustus at Reims. And they also admit that Lawrence became a school of mysticism and theology and spread its religious ideas far and wide by useful works in dogma and polemics and hagiography. So says the Catholic Encyclopedia in its reference. So the monastic schools introduced mysticism into the simple religion of the early church in Gaul. There was significant resistance to the monastic mysticism, and many of the priesthood were married. It was the Merovingian dynasty which finally introduced the Roman system at the point of the sword. 417, when Pope Zosimus made Patroclus Bishop of Arles his vicar or delegate in Gaul. All disputes had been referred to Milan, where the Council of Milan decided the matter. That was the standard way. Milan Church was established by Ambrosius. That relationship from Milan extended into the Sabbatati or the Valencians, the Valenzas. The church in Gaul were in dispute as to the nature of God on an extended basis, and the churches were continually subordinationist. They simply would not accept the views of Rome and the Orthodox. So the Church of Gaul passed through 3 dogmatic crises. Its bishops seem to have been greatly preoccupied with Arianism. As a rule, they clung to the teachings of Nicaea in spite of a few temporary or partial defections.
Right.
And the result, this term Arianism is a misnomer and a ploy by the Trinitarians to make it appear as though Arianism is some sort of minor aberration from the time of Nicaea
Right.
under Arius. Now, that's not true at all. Far from it.
Mm-hmm.
The Unitarian structure of the church comes from Christ in the 1st century and the apostles. It had nothing to do with Arius. Arius was merely an advisor in logic to he was an officer of the church who advised. He wasn't at the Council of Nicaea as a bishop.
Right.
He was there as an advisor on logic to the council, and he left when they didn't need him. He wasn't there all the time. Mm-hmm. And to suggest that Unitarianism is an Arian doctrine of the 4th century is an utter lie and a heresy.
Yeah. Very underhandedly tricky, aren't they, deceitful?
Yes, it is total deception by the Trinitarian system. So, and Sabbath keeping was extant in Rome under Gregory I from 590 to 604. Gregory wrote against this practice, and that's contained in the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, 2nd series, volume 13, page 13. It says, Gregory, bishop by the grace of God, to his well-beloved sons, the Roman citizens, it has come to me that certain men of perverse spirit have disseminated among you things depraved and opposed to the holy faith, so that they forbid anything to be done on the day of the Sabbath. What shall I call them except preachers of Antichrist? Right. Epistles B13:1. So Gregory pronounced against a section of the city of Rome because it kept the Sabbath, and he held that when Antichrist would come, that he would keep Saturday as the Sabbath. No doubt. Christ.
He won't have any choice.
Yeah.
Oh, he will, but his options for whatever choice he makes aren't too good.
This is setting the grounds to claim that the Christ is the Antichrist because he reinstates the Sabbaths and the new moons. That's what this is all about.
Right.
This is out of the mouth of Satan, not anything else.
Very underhanded, yes.
And then, of course, won't we go on into the paper of the Sabbath Church in Asia?
Yeah.
And, the church located in Asia Minor was termed Paulician.
Yep, yes.
It might be a hint that it was set up by Paul.
Yeah.
Well, the Paulicians were extending right through up to the Taurus Mountains, and they were located basically between the church in Arabia and the Byzantine structure, the Byzantines.
Right.
Right.
And they were opposed to the Byzantines, and the Byzantines from Constantinople couldn't bludgeon them into submission, and they opposed that, and they were Unitarian Christians, and that was what the Islamists became under the Prophet Qasim when they established the church at Becca Petra.
Right.
They were the same as the Paulicians, and they had the same doctrines, and they were allies of the Paulicians. And that went on, and the Paulicians lasted right up through into the 19th century.
Wow. Yeah.
And Lady Mary Wortley Montagu observed them in the Taurus Mountains in the 1900s.
Right.
And that's important, that these guys were still there operating, keeping their views.
They must have been quite isolated to be able to exist that long.
Well, they were strong, and they were supported by the Muslims.
Right.
And Scripture does say that the one true church will always be in existence.
Yes.
There's no point in history where you can't find it somewhere if you
Yes.
look for it.
Right.
Yes.
That's right.
And that's what happened. And the Turks outlawed the Bektashi Muslims. They killed 5 million of these Bektashi and Muslim people, the Sufi types. But amongst that, they got over 1 million Paulicians. And they killed them in the area through up towards the Black Sea.
Right. And it says here that making its appearance first on the eastern borders of the empire and having a natural home in Armenia, Mesopotamia and northern Syria. And then they spread that way into Eastern Europe to establish new centres in the Balkan Peninsula. And they increased in numbers, Wade, the Paulicians, they got quite large, didn't they?
Yes, well, as I said, in the 1900s, they killed, there was 1 million of them executed along with the Bektashi. In the 5 million, there was over 1 million Paulicians.
Right.
And they were Sabbath-keeping Unitarian Christians, and they were protected under the Bektashi. All of this is extremely important, and it shows that it doesn't matter what these weasel worders, these Trinitarians say about how the Sabbath wasn't a functioning system. It was a functioning system, and it gave rise to Islam and the Paulicians and the structure all through the East. You can't pretend that it wasn't there, which is what they try and do.
Right, yes.
And you can't pretend that anyone kept Sunday in the early church from Christ through until it emerged as a heresy in Rome. That's where Sunday worship comes from. It's got nothing to do with Christianity.
No, no.
And that's why you find in the early eras of the church there was a fairly large group in Rome itself.
Yes.
Because they could actually have a bit more freedom. I mean, in today's modern age, I mean, if a Christian church showed up at the Vatican, they're not going to necessarily be attacked, but they wouldn't be able to start to protest out the front that, you know, the Vatican's got it wrong on a Sunday. It should be a Saturday. They could be in a bit of trouble.
Yes.
Yes. No, none of that was permitted, will be permitted, and when the witnesses get here, there will be a problem. When they start to stamp the system out, Judah will be corrected after the Church of God is corrected first. And the people claiming the allegiance in the churches of God to Christ as part of the church and who are keeping Hillel and worshipping two gods will not be in the first resurrection. When Christ gets here, they will either repent or they will die. And we need to understand this, and we need also to understand where these Sabbath-keeping people were, how they were protected and how God used them in different ways. For instance, the Paulicians were protected by Constantine Copronymus in 741 to 775, and they were invited to settle in Thrace. Nicephorus in 802 to 811 employed them in the protection of the empire on its eastern frontier. Michael and Leo V ruthlessly persecuted them. So they were in favour and used by some of these emperors on the Eastern Empire at Constantinople, but then ruthlessly suppressed by others. But the Paulicians, this is what Scott says in his article, but the Paulicians were too numerous, too warlike, and too well organised to be dragooned into orthodoxy. They resisted, revolted, and even retaliated by raiding Asia Minor from their mountain fastness. After 20 years of comparative tranquility, they were exposed to still more violent persecution under Theodora from 842 to 857, which under Basil developed into a war of extermination. See Krumbacher, page 1075. The Paulicians were driven into the arms of the Saracens and with some assistance from them under the leadership of the able ruler Chrysochir, they not only successfully resisted the imperial forces but forced them back and pillaged Asia Minor up to its western shores. Now that's really important, and this is, you see how the Muslims and the Paulicians were supported, and they supported each other because of the same faith. And they were not Trinitarians. They were Unitarian Christians, and that's what the original Islamic faith was.
Right, yeah.
Now this demonstrates two aspects of the Paulicians. Firstly, they used arms, and secondly, the Muslims regarded them as a separate group to Trinitarian Christians and rendered them assistance and protection. This protection was not confined to Asia Minor, but also extended into Spain, because you remember Spain was part of the Umayyad dynasty in the Islamic invasions and organised occupations of Spain.
Spain for quite a while, along the
Yes,
road.
yes.
Yep.
And that's where they were also protected. And we'll see that as we deal with the Inquisitions under Paper 170 and these differences in the church. The comment by Christ against the Pergamum church, which is the Pergamus era, which might be identified with this sect, is thus made more intelligible when he says in Revelation 2:16 that he will fight against them, that is, those holding false doctrines among them, with the sword of his mouth, because they were a military organisation. You can see that in Revelation chapter 2 about these people. They are military people, and he uses military terms against them.
Right.
And Scott records that a second deportation of Paulicians from Armenia to Thrace was carried out on a large scale by John Tzimiskes in 970. Latin Crusaders found the sect in Syria in the 11th century, and Lady Mary Montagu, as I'd mentioned before, found them in the neighbourhood of Philippopolis in the 18th century, and they were there through until the 19th century.
Right.
In Europe, they developed into an amalgamation with the Bogomils. That's beloved of God, is what it means.
Beloved of God, yes.
Yeah. And their views and influences were propagated throughout the Middle Ages by various anti-Catholic sects, and these are listed as the Cathari, Albigenses, whose affiliation with the Paulicians is probable, though difficult to trace. Their names, like Manichaeans, became in turn a generic description of any of these movements who opposed the development of Catholic hierarchy and doctrine. Scott, I bid.
And they still try and pull that trick off in this day and age, don't they? They set plants into certain churches to try and corrupt the actual correct understanding and
Correct.
you know,
They did that to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who were Unitarian Sabbatarians, and they, when the great Unitarian theologian Uriah Smith died in 1931, they swamped it with Jesuit plants in the church, and by 1956 they'd taken over the ministry of the Seventh-day Adventists, and by 1978 they'd so reprogrammed and brainwashed the Adventist brethren that they declared Trinitarianism in their doctrinal statements.
right.
That's how bad it was. From Unitarianism under Uriah Smith in 1931 to 1978, they then were Trinitarian apologists, and still controlled by Jesuit plants.
And a similar thing happened to the Worldwide Church, didn't it?
Yes, they were penetrated by Jews and Masons, Freemasons, and by Catholics, Trinitarians, and by plants of the CIA and other intelligence organisations.
Now we move over to the Eastern Europe and expansion of the Sabbath keeping.
Yes, yes. I think the text is worthwhile noting that we go on through dealing with the Piffleys of Flanders and the Publiani and various other things, but it's important that you follow this through the notes. And there are Sabbath keepers all over the world.
Yeah.
Now, East European Sabbath keeping was quite significant. We can see that develop, and they moved from Thrace into Albania and Bulgaria with the Paulicians. In the 9th century, this dispute had erupted in Bulgaria. It's noted that Bulgaria, in the early season of its evangelization, had been taught that no work should be performed on the Sabbath. And that's, you see the references there. Aphiles' work on volume 4. Bulgaris, ruling prince of Bulgaria, wrote to Pope Nicholas I on a number of questions regarding this matter. In answer to question 6, rebathing and work on the Sabbath, he replied, bathing is allowed on Sunday. Question 10, one is to cease from work on Sunday but not also on the Sabbath. That's in Aphiles' work. Nicholas was declared excommunicated by a counter-synod in Constantinople. Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople, accused the papacy. Against the canons, they induced the Bulgarians to fast on the Sabbath. Photius. And that's dealing with Hergenrother. The Sabbath question became a bitter dispute between the Greeks and the Latins. And Neil commented on this in regard to the split in 1064, the history of the Holy Eastern Church. The Athenians, or the Athengani of the 9th century, were held by Cardinal Hergenrother to have stood in intimate relation with Emperor Michael II from 821 to 829, and he states that they held the Sabbath. And the Athengani were a sect in Phrygia and were referred to as Melchizedekites by Timotheus of Constantinople in his reception of heretics. And you see that in the ERE, under sects. Whiteley says that they observed the Sabbath day as they touched nothing. They touched no one. They were popularly called Athengani. This reads as if they observed the Jewish rules of cleanliness, but the information is too scanty to trace their origin and tenets. Now, after the defeat of Chrysocheir, leader of the Paulicians in the 9th century, and the destruction of Tefraki, their stronghold, they were decimated and dispersed, and they existed in scattered communities in Armenia, in Asia Minor, and especially in the Balkan Peninsula. In the middle of the 9th century, they experienced revival in Armenia under Simbat, who according to Conybeare, may have been the author of the Key of Truth. That's in the ERE article Paulicians, volume 9, page 697. Headquartered at the town of Thondrak, they received the name the Thondrakians. These various names were attempts by the ruling and orthodox systems to try and make it appear as though there were minor disparate sects. So they called them after Waldensians or Thondrakians or Athengani or whatever, but they were all Sabbatarian Unitarians.
Yeah, they tried to convolute the whole areas by having different names and so they could separate them all.
Yes,
they're all the same.
Making them appear as though they're isolated minor aberrations against the main Trinitarian orthodoxy.
Right, yeah.
And that was not so true at all. They were a major organisation right throughout the people, right around the world.
Right, yeah.
And the second deportation under John Simiskis in 970 then occurred after these Thondrakians.
Right.
And this is all attacked and all tried to break them up under different names.
Yeah,
well, technically they were all the Church of God.
Yes.
But yeah, they tried to hide them away from everybody to make them not as sort of important or as big by, as you say, giving them all these little names.
Different names and
Now Whitley says, and this is important, the Paulicians always objected to their rivals' worship of the cross.
Right.
the Armenian Khazars. Therefore the term Khazitsari, or the Khazitsarians, the Greek is the storolatre from the storos,
Right,
the state,
Yep.
see. They seem to denote no small sect, but the established Church of Armenia as viewed by the Paulicians. That's how big they were.
Yes.
All of Armenia
Right.
were these Paulician groups.
Right.
Now, Troitsky, in his article on the Greek Orthodox Church in the ERE, article notes that the Athengani were linked to Judaism. They're grouped with but not specifically identified as Paulicians. Troitsky seems to group the Paulicians as having a belief of a mystic character, which we know to be incorrect from the extant works. There seems little doubt that the Paulicians and the Athengani, or the sects in Asia Minor, kept the Sabbath and the food laws and carried these practices into Europe. All of that's important.
Yeah. Very.
Well, then, wait, we move on to the Bogomils.
Yes, the Bogomil. Yes, that's one of the first groups to emanate from the Paulicians directly into Europe. Appears to have been the Bogomils, who occurred among the Slavs and particularly the Bulgars. And that became, when you got the term poor bugre, or poor bugger,
Right. That derives from.
that derives from the
Wow.
pauvre bourgeois, which is the
Bulgars.
French word which means poor Bulgars.
Right.
They're Bogomils.
Bogomil. Bulgarian.
Yeah, and that's where it comes from. I'll give you to the boogeyman. They became,
Right.
these were turned into demonized by the Trinitarian system. And the term is probably derived from Bogmilu, meaning God have mercy, or perhaps a Bogomil, or beloved of God.
Right.
Bogomil.
Yeah.
And two earlier Bulgarian manuscripts which confirm each other state that Pope Bogomile was first to present the heresy under Bulgarian Tsar Peter 927 to 968. Thus the name may be derived from a prominent representative of the sect in the 10th century.
Right.
But they came from the Paulicians, and that's what
Yep.
they are.
Extension of the Paulicians.
Yeah. These are the Thyatiran era, as we'll discuss under 170 and
Right.
other areas. The Bogomils are described as a Neo-Manichaean sect by N.A. Weber, Catholic Encyclopedia, article Bogomils, Volume 2, page 612. The sect is noted as being found in the later Middle Ages at Constantinople and in the Balkan states. The Bogomils held that both Satan and Christ had the power of creation under the will of God. Correct.
That's right.
You know, you think of Job and what Satan was allowed to do to Job.
Yes.
Well, exactly.
Getting
Yeah.
boils and
Satan was there with Christ in the Garden of Eden
Yes.
when they created Adam.
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Now, the Bogomils held that God the Father had a human appearance but was incorporeal. The sons of God, including Satan or Azazel, who sat at the right hand of God, and Jesus or Michael. Satan was endowed with creative power, but he rebelled, and together with the angels who followed him, he was cast out of the heavens. Satan was held to have created a second heaven and a second earth, and formed man out of earth and water. Satan could not give man a living spirit, and thus the Father bestowed life on man at their request. From the seduction of Eve, Satan lost his creative power but still retained rulership of the planet. And God sent another son, Jesus, to be assumed bodily form through Mary. Thus Satan was judged by the actions of Christ, and Satan now lost the divine name or El rank and thus became known merely as Satan. Now this history is written by the Orthodox enemies, right? Everything written about the church is written by its enemies. And the truth is very difficult to get out of these systems, and you see the doctrines of the church emerge out of all of these persecutions.
Right.
And what they were looking for. But it's in the Inquisitions that we see how they identified the church and how they pulled up some of the Muslims and the Jews in their persecution of the church because the Jews held similar doctrines,
Right.
and the Muslims held similar doctrines.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what it was all about.
Yeah.
So the concept is that ultimately the only surviving person in heaven is God the Father, both Christ and Satan being absorbed, and this is the concept of God becoming all in all. The concept is perhaps explained away in simplistic terms by the Orthodox because it does not comply with the soul doctrine. And that's the important thing. The soul doctrine was an accident among these people,
Right.
and they didn't agree with the Orthodox soul doctrine concept, nor with heaven and hell, nor with the structures of the Orthodox at all. Now, Weber wrote, he was a Catholic writing on this, he claimed that the Bogomil rejected the Old Testament other than the Psalter and the prophetical books, and it appears to be based on Euthemius. You see also Powyk's comments, which we've located, and where there are 52 heads of belief. And the main listed by Powyk and summarised is as follows. The rejection of the Mosaic books. Christ's history was symbolic of a higher knowledge. They taught a Sabellian concept of the Godhead, saying that all three names of the Father, Son and Holy Spirit apply to the Father. In the end, all three spirits have done their work, will flow back to the Father. The concept of all flowing to the Father is not just confined to a Trinity, as Euthemius would assert, from the concept of the union of the host. The satanic creation was extended to the law, which begat sin. God intervened in the world and dispatched the angel Michael as the Logos, which became Jesus Christ. That was the doctrine of the church for many, many centuries. The Holy Spirit was held to be only in the elect, which they equated with the Bogomili. And that's what we believe today. The Holy Spirit is held only in the baptized elect.
Yeah.
6, the elect cannot die. 7, the temples of the church were the temples of demons, but they permitted worship there out of expediency. 8, they alleged to have held that John the Baptist was a servant of the Jewish god Satan. Would be absolutely incorrect, and that's not a doctrine of the churches of God ever. But we will see.
And that's like the pot calling the kettle black, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, and the claim that the sect rejected water baptism, holding only spiritual baptism with the laying on of hands, is perhaps derived from the intrusion of the sect into the monastic orders. And the sect denied the doctrine of transubstantiation. Weber held that the sect condemned marriage and prohibited the eating of meat. The Bogomils extended over several centuries as a monastic order. As their writings were burnt, what is known of them seems to be derived from Euthemius Zigabenus, who died 1118, in chapter 27 of Panoplia Dogmatic, in which he refuted some 24 of the alleged heresies under 52 heads, coming from Powyk. So Weber considers the Bogomili may have developed from the Euchites, probably from the dualistic nature of their doctrines. They were also called Massalians, whence they derived their asceticism. This aberration of unknown date seems to set them apart from the other groups, and they came into prominence in the 12th century. They were first mentioned by name at Philippopolis, European Turkey, in 1115. And note the continued occupation by the Paulicians here as above. Their leader Basil, a monk and physician who had appointed 12 apostles, was seized and imprisoned in 1111 after being tricked by Alexius I Comnenus 1081 to 1118, who demanded retraction of the errors, and some retracted, some died in prison. Basil was condemned to death from 1118 and burned in 1119, according to Powyk. A synod of Constantinople in 1140 ordered the destruction of its writings, and in 1143 2 bishops of Cappadocia were deposed for embracing its tenets. And the synods of Constantinople in 1316 and 1325 again condemned the sect. The Bogomili remained until the conquest of the Balkans by the Turks in the 14th and 15th centuries. What appears, in my view, what appears to be the case is that the Paulician doctrines were not only existed in the societies to which they were transported and in the Slavic communities which surrounded them, but also they were adopted within monastic orders, where they became distorted by the monks, but nevertheless anti-Catholic. The Bogomil doctrines as presented represented divergence from the other sects derived from the Paulicians and indeed from the doctrines of the Paulicians themselves. It is thus incorrect to assert that the sect found among the monastic order as Bogomils were in fact the general groups of that name, which spread among the Slavs and across Europe. The mean view of the doctrines can best be found from a comparison between the Paulicians and the European sects which were influenced by them. The subordinationist or anti-Trinitarian sects were to spread across Europe, and the sects were known by various titles.
Well, and also we've got a section here on the Waldensians, and again they seem to be a significant part of the church history, don't they?
Yes, right, very important. Very important.
And they were located way down in the southern French Alps area, were they?
Yes, the Valenzas, and on into southern Spain, into northern Spain. They were spread, in the end, they spread all over Europe. There were the Sabbatarians in Transylvania, weren't just another branch of these, so they're into Eastern Europe,
right,
up in Transylvania.
Yeah.
They're the same views and doctrines, and they were just another branch of the Waldensians.
Right, or the Paulicians.
The Paulicians, they were a similar branch.
Right.
They were all Sabbatarian, Unitarian, keepers of the laws of God.
Right,
and
moving into more recent times.
Yes,
as
yes.
The rest of the church eras.
They used full adult baptism. They denied this infant baptism, and they denied the heaven and hell, and they denied Sunday worship, and they kept the Sabbath and the feasts and the food laws. And we know from the Sabbatarians in Transylvania that right up through until the 19th century, they were keeping the Sabbaths, they were keeping the food laws, they kept the new moons, they kept all the feasts, they kept the wave sheaf, they kept all of that structure through, and it was important that they kept everything we do. When you look at, and we've translated the Rabbi Cohn's work from the German into the English and written a foreword on it so that we know exactly what they believed and taught. And it's exactly the same as CCG doctrines.
Wonderful.
What we teach is exactly what they teach. And what we did notice was that one of the United ministers did a synopsis, so-called translation of some of their doctrines, and he deliberately left out the new moons out of the listing of the doctrines of the church.
Right, yes.
Because they didn't keep them in United, did they?
Right.
And it's interesting that, it says the Sabbath is a sign, and they all equate that to Saturday.
Yeah.
They forget about the new moons.
Yes.
Which are actually a new moon Sabbath.
The new moon is a Sabbath,
yes,
and always has been in the Church of God. And that's important, that we understand the new moon is a Sabbath, standing alongside and equal to the weekly Sabbath. This history in the Waldensians is extremely important in dealing with what was happening through the Vaudois, and that's where they got the name, the Vaudois, Valenzas, and Waldensians. It came from Valenzas, not from Peter Waldo,
right,
who became one of them.
Yeah.
And so it's quite erroneous to say the name came from Waldo. It came from Valenzas, from the Vaudois, and it was the Waldensians from Vaudois.
Yep.
So the history of that And Peter Waldo was converted in 1173 by the Vaudois, the Valensas. You'll see the history of where we've dealt with Mouston's history and the Israel of the Alps, the breakdown of the history of the Waldensians, the different descriptions of them through the 14th century and then the 16th and 17th into the 18th century, and they claim to have existed at the time of the fathers. They trace their ancestry back to the early church fathers.
Right.
And all of that is listed in this text under the Waldensians or Waldenses, and you'll see all of that historically. And if you haven't read it, then you're not really interested in the history of your own church. And all of that is important. The churches of the Vaudois are discussed, and the authorities that deal with it are also discussed. And things like Adini, Ledger, Mouston, other of the Waldenses also wrote about their activities in apostolic times. I think it's important that we all look and understand and work out where we were and where they came from and what they taught, what they believed, because these people are the Sabbath-keeping church in Western and Eastern Europe. You can't deal with it. You can't ignore it. And they were also in Britain. This structure of the church went through, and it was in the Reformation in Britain that the dispute of Sabbath keeper versus Sunday keeper emerged. And the Sunday worship, the Catholics, managed to persuade them that they had to keep Sunday so they could all be uniform. And the claim of uniformity was then presented as the necessary steps. Doesn't matter what God says, doesn't matter what the 10 Commandments say, and the 4th commandment says you keep holy the Sabbath day. Forget that. We want to keep Sunday because that's uniform with Rome.
We've got more power than God, because
yes, we've got more power than God.
we can change the Bible at will. It's shocking.
Yeah, so all of this is important. Goes through into what was happening in southern France. We deal with that and the Petrobrusians from Peter of Bruges, and who was martyred, and the structure of all these people, how they organised the church and what they did and how they were persecuted and eliminated. We talk about this movement, and this text talks about the movement right across Europe and through then to the Waldensian Sabbatati. We deal with that as the basis of what their doctrines were. They were Sabbath-keeping subordinationist Unitarians, and well before Peter Waldo was on the scene. And Douglas Dodd's work on the history of the true religion, whilst useful, is not perhaps as authoritative as we would like it, but it is reasonably useful, and I've managed to quote some of his works, also according to Alex and his works, and it's most important. These quotes are important to your understanding of the history also. And we talk about Alex's work, and the Reformers held that the Waldensian Church was formed about 120 AD, and from which date on they passed down from father to son the teachings they received from the apostles. Well, this is important.
Very early.
Very early. In the Latin Bible, the italic was translated from the Greek not later than 157 AD. So he uses the term. We are indebted to Beza, the renowned associate of Calvin, for the statement that the Italic Church dates from 120 AD. Alex, Churches of Piedmont, 1690 edition, page 177. And Wilkinson, Our Authorized Bible Vindicated, page 35, and Scrivener's Introduction, volume 2, page 43, of Duggar and Dodd, A History of the True Religion, pages 224 to 225. Now, the formation in 120 is consistent with the dispatch of the disciples of Polycarp from Smyrna and Ephesus, and as we have dealt with in the persecution of the church at Lyon under Marcus Aurelius in 177, where Photinus, disciple of Polycarp, was martyred, and the passage of information back to Smyrna. The churches in Gaul were subjected to the council in Milan for centuries, as is established herein until papal interference. Duggar and Dodd also note, page 226, that Atto, bishop of Veruli, had complained of such people 80 years before the year 1026 AD, and so had others before him, and there is the highest reason to believe that they had always existed in Italy. Compare Jones' Church History, page 218. So thus the establishment of the Waldensian College in Milan is a natural extension of this orientation. Duggar and Dodd go on to quote Mosheim in saying, in Lombardy, which was the principal residence of the Italian heretics, there sprang a singular sect known, for what reason I cannot tell, by the denomination Pasaginians. Like the other sects already mentioned, they had the utmost aversion to the discipline and dominion of the Church of Rome, but they were at the same time distinguished by two religious tenets which were peculiar to themselves. The first was a notion that the observance of the law of Moses in everything except the offering of sacrifices was obligatory upon Christians, in consequence of which they abstained from those meats, the use of which was prohibited under Mosaic economy, and celebrated the Jewish Sabbath. And the second tenet that distinguished this sect was advanced in opposition to the doctrine of three persons in the divine nature. Ecclesiastical Histories, Century 12, Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 14, page 127, is quoted by Duggar and Dodd, emphasis retained. So they went on to say that the Cathari did retain and observe the ancient Sabbath, as certified by Romish adversaries. Now, these quotes and structures are important, and they're there for the education of the Church of God in the 21st century, so that you know what these people believe. What our ancestors believed and died for is critical for us to understand and to know what is true. Because in the 20th century, the churches of God were told a pack of lies by people who were put in there deliberately to tell them lies, and some of them because they didn't know any different.
Right.
And like they say, once you put a bad apple in there, they all become bad, don't they?
Well, that's right.
And they all follow the same.
They don't know what was good because they've never heard of it.
No.
Yes. Yes, it continues on. Now, what we've done also is deal with the fact that the Waldensians were a subordinationist sect prior to and at 1179, just prior to the Lateran Council. This is not even mentioned by Weber. Their two barbes, that means uncles, they called them barbes because they were prohibited from calling anyone father. So the barbes were Olivia and Sicard, fell into dispute with the Bishop of Montpellier between 1175 and 76, and 2 or 3 years later, Pope Alexander III sent the Cardinal of St. Chrysogony, Henry of Citeaux, and Reginald Bishop of Bath, then on his way to the Lateran Council and accompanied by the monk Walter Mapes and the priest Raymond of Daventry to Toulouse to inquire into the matter. 2 barbes of the Valenzas came there under safe conduct, Bernard of Raymond and Raymond of Bamiac, to be examined by John of Belesmains, Bishop of Poitiers. They then went to Narbonne to be examined by Bernard of Fontcaude under the presidentship of the English priest Raymond of Daventry. And it is this priest, Raymond of Daventry, who first used the name of Valenzas or Waldenses. Thus they were named by their inquisitors for one of their leaders. The two Barbes were condemned as heretics in 1179 by Raymond of Daventry, who then proceeded to the Lateran Council. Naming sects for major leaders has been the usual practice for centuries and gives a false impression as to the stream of thoughts and groupings they represent.
Right.
Now, in 1180, Bernard of Fontcode wrote the book entitled Adversus Valensas et Arianos. And you see Gay in the History of the Vaudois, page 16, number 1, note 1. And also Adene, Ibid, page 667. Adene says that it seems that these discussions arose out of the opinion of the Petrobrusians and Henricians with the poor men of Lyon in Provence. About the same time, Waldo's followers unite with the Arnaldists in Lombardy. Thus the Waldensians of France and Italy were united, and their union was cemented by persecution. A sentence of excommunication by the Council of Verona cleared the remaining followers of Waldo out of Lyon and drove them to Provence, Dauphin, and the valleys of the Piedmont, Lombardy, and some even to Germany. So numerous had they become that Innocent III sent his best legates to suppress them in the years 1198, 1201 and 1203. There's no doubt, however, we're dealing with a subordinationist Unitarian doctrine which was classed as and with Arianism. In the suppression of 1203, the legates included a Spanish bishop and Dominic, called Saint, the founder of Dominicans, who then took part in the Inquisition with the Benedictines. They conducted a succession of disputations lasting until 1207, when the legate Peter of Châteauneuf was killed. 2 years later, the Pope declared the Crusade. Adeni merely refers to the Crusade as a crusade, but was in fact the Albigensian Crusade, and the Waldensians were the subject of this crusade in the same sense. In 1210, the Emperor Otto ordered the Archbishop of Turin to drive the Waldensians out of his diocese, and in 1220, the statutes of Pignerol forbade the inhabitants to harbour them. Some fled to Picardy, and Philip Augustus drove them on to Flanders. Some came to Mayence and Bingen, where 50 were burnt in 1232. Adeni, I bid. They were seen in early Spain, condemned by church councils and harried by 3 of the kings. I bid. This period over the Inquisition and the Albigensian Crusade, which extended into Spain from France, you see below in these texts. These people were aggregations of varying groups of Christians. At least some of these groups not only appeared to be Sabbath keepers in these early times, but also were persecuted for keeping the biblical holy days. It's not imperative that we read all this stuff out. The discussion is here to try and get you all to realize that this history is very important. And it's talking to you about a conflict which has over 2,000 years. Now, the reality is that we're about to see the end of this age. And as it goes, we are going to see this Trinitarian-Unitarian conflict emerge. But it will not simply be Christ resolving the issue when he gets here. It's a matter of the beast power under Satan will turn against this Trinitarian system because it created it in the first place. Satan has the power to deal with it as he will, because he invented the doctrines for this beast power. God didn't. And if you don't keep the laws of God and the testimony and faith of the Christ, you're not part of the elect. You don't have the seal of God on your forehead. And you're not under the protection of God. It's that simple.
Yep. And through these histories, it's quite easy to trace the true church, because one, it would be Unitarian,
Yes,
or two, it would be keeping against that day Sabbath.
Yeah.
Three, it keeps the holy days.
yes. There is no one of these Sabbatarian groups that ever kept 2 gods or 3 gods, and none of them kept Sunday worship, Christmas or Easter. They kept always Sabbaths, new moons, the feasts completely, and they always kept the food laws.
By the temple calendar under the Jubilee system.
Yes, yes, and that's the important structure of how it goes. From the Council of Orleans, from 1190, they were ordered to be delivered up in chains, and we've dealt with that in some of the B series. And that system, all these orders and these determinations against the Sabbath-keeping church is still extant. But you have to realise what the doctrines of the church are. And you have to realise that the doctrines in the 20th century under the Sardis and Laodicean systems are not correct doctrines. And that for that reason, those people will not enter the first resurrection. They have to repent.